Welcome to China in Context from the SOAS China Institute at the University of London. I'm Duncan Hewitt. The annual session of China's legislature earlier this month set a course for slower GDP growth, with a target of 4.5 to 5%, the lowest since 1991. It also passed, with only a single dissenting vote, the country's new five-year plan, which calls for higher quality growth with an emphasis on self-reliance and innovation in high technology of all kinds, and pledges to promote domestic consumption and improve the livelihoods of China's citizens. The National People's Congress, or NPC, also passed a new law promoting ethnic unity, which, among other things, enshrines the use of Mandarin in schools in ethnic minority regions of the country. And the legislative meetings, known in China as the Two Sessions, also saw China's Foreign Minister Wang Yi set out his priorities against the backdrop of tension in the Middle East. Well, later in the podcast, we'll be looking at the political significance of all this with Professor Christopher Mittelstaedt of the University of Zurich. But first, for an assessment of China's economic plans, I've been talking to Evelyn Cheng, senior Beijing correspondent for CNBC. Speaking before Donald Trump suggested that his planned trip to Beijing in late March could be delayed, I asked her first to describe the mood at this year's NPC session, after a year in which China had seen great technological progress, but also faced a range of economic challenges, both at home and abroad.
So overall, it was a bit more serious, the tone throughout the NPC. That was a bit of a surprise to me because last year at the two sessions, there was a lot of conversation about DeepSeek and how amazing it was and how it was really showing China's technological capabilities. And I thought for sure this year there must be similar sorts of enthusiasm because one, everyone was expecting DeepSeek to release a new model, which it still hasn't, but other Chinese companies have really stepped up their game in terms of releasing new models that are really narrowing the gap with the US competitors and far cheaper to use. And then there's also the humanoid robots, which have been performing a lot. And of course, in terms of soft power, there's Labubu and the Ninja 2 animated film. So all of these things, I thought there would be a much more buoyant tone. But obviously, as the two sessions got going this year, we had the Iran war breakout, and overall China's own economy still faces a lot of challenges. So overall, there's a lot more focus and seriousness about, yes, there have been advances in Chinese technology and AI, but that's something that the country needs to really press harder on, work harder, because there are so many difficulties. And in fact, there was one official who is in charge of drafting that government work report, setting the GDP targets. And, someone asked him, why was it in this 4.5 to 5% range, which is the lowest since the 90s? And this official basically acknowledged that they need to prepare for unexpected overseas shocks, and that we all know what these overseas shocks might be. Obviously, China has other issues domestically as well that it needs to pay attention to. But I thought that that was a very clear signal of what's on these officials' minds right now.
With these shocks, are they talking, do you think, mainly about the war in the Middle East and the impact on oil prices? Or is it more broad? Is it still relating to the US tariffs that we've seen over the past year?
US tariffs are probably much more impactful because of how much China's economy is relying on exports, and even more because of the decline in the real estate sector, which has contributed to something like more than a quarter of China's economy in past years. And that slump has only declined more this year. S&P earlier this year, S&P Global Ratings, they actually revised down their expectations for the drop in China's real estate sector. So it's going to be worse than the decline they initially expected. And then the consumer side of things, spending has still been pretty soft, even though there are a lot of records in terms of spending for the Chinese New Year period. The average amount spent per person, depending how you cut it, was actually slightly lower. So people are still very budget conscious. And that's been a consistent theme since last year, even, record numbers, record levels of people moving around, but companies need to compete for every cent.
We talked with Andy Rothman, the economic analyst, on our last episode, and he talked a lot about the attempts to revive consumption, with which the whole real estate issue and the slump over the last 5 years is very much bound up. Did you get a sense from either the Premier Li Qiang's work report or what you saw in the 5-year plan that the government has really serious measures that are going to tackle some of these issues? There was also talk about how much they would raise welfare payments, for example, and we saw, a small increase in pensions for rural people. But many people have said that this is not a huge boost to the economy.
There isn't the large-scale stimulus that markets investors have been hoping for, for quite a long time. On real estate, the language was that whatever measures were taken to stabilize the real estate sector last year, that those were effective. And the points on what they might do to support real estate further in the next year or 5 years, basically in line with what they've said before, so nothing new. And in terms of consumption, yes, it's called a priority, and they are keeping some of the same trade-in programs, trying to give people, especially in rural areas, a bit more of a cushion on the social welfare side so that they might, want to spend a bit more. But again, it's not anything new or really big. And if you look actually at the 5-year plan, the consumption section doesn't come until after quite a bit of discussion about technology. And so that still signals to me that over the next 5 years, technology is really where China wants to put a lot of its energy and resources. Because consumption, at the end of the day, you can have social welfare, you can have a lot of programs, but you still need people's confidence to come back to really spend. And maybe there's an acknowledgement that they can't just engineer that. But what does the economy need to keep growing? Well, maybe technology can be a driver of that. And even though it might not completely offset everything that's happening in real estate or other parts of the traditional economy, it may be enough to get them past the next 5 years.
There is a lot of emphasis in the new 5-year plan on what's called high quality growth. We also saw the announcement of 800 billion Chinese yuan, more than 100 billion US dollars in these long-term treasury bonds, which is focused on science and technology. Self-reliance projects, another of the buzzwords that we heard a lot about this year. Things like integrated circuits, industrial machine tools. You observe very closely the whole sector of things like AI and robotics and all of this new industry. Will these kind of government measures have a big impact? And in terms of jobs, can it create the jobs that they really do need at the moment with high unemployment, particularly among young people in the cities?
I think the challenge for supporting technology and also wanting to have that produce more jobs is that the technology industries often require people with very high skills. And so how do you take your current workforce, your current graduates, and train them up for those really high-end research jobs that these companies need in order to make tech breakthroughs? I think that's a very difficult thing. China is trying to ramp up its vocational education programs. So as they push for AI to be used in industry and actually for commercial use, people learning skills that are more tied to trades, they can work directly with companies even before they graduate, so that by the time the students graduate, they actually have a job directly waiting for them. So that's an area that China as a whole has been pushing, and they've opened specific schools for that.
So who is really behind this? Is this coming out of the education ministry? And do you have a sense that the people pushing these ideas really know what actually is needed for today's new industries, which are changing so rapidly?
For vocational education, definitely Ministry of Education is behind that. And then the idea of what is actually the technology that we need, that's something where we've had officials during the NBC say they They want businesses to take more of a lead in. They want businesses to say, we need to innovate on this point. We should research some other topic more, and also set the standards for assessing what research was valuable. But I think the question still is, how does this look in practice? Because if you have a lot of funding coming from the state, and as you know, there's lots of integrated interests and also entrenched habits and ways of thinking. So how does that translate into something more market oriented, where the business is really leading? I think there's still lots of questions and uncertainty.
And do you get a sense of the mood among people in private enterprise, entrepreneurs who are supposedly creating lots of these jobs? Do you have a feeling of how confident they are to invest more?
Overall, if a company is in, let's say, humanoids, AI model development, electric cars, for the last couple of years, it's been, okay, we're moving ahead, we're moving fast, we're trying hard, and there's lots of competition. Other parts of the economy, businesses in other sectors like leisure and operating hostels, they're saying, yes, we see more and more people, but they're still very budget conscious and basically running harder to make the same amount of money. And so at what point does that burn people out? I think is a really big question.
How do you think young people are responding to what they're hearing from their leaders? You know, we've heard for several years about an educated young generation who are frustrated by the lack of job prospects. Are they in any way inspired by all the talk about AI and new technology, or is that struggling to really cut through at the grassroots?
I think in the last couple weeks, you've seen with the open claw, this latest wave of interest, that AI is this opportunity that everyone can access. It's an AI agent, essentially a tool that was developed by an Austrian developer, and people around the world have been downloading it because it's free. And if you connect it to an existing AI model, whether it's ChatGPT or one of the Chinese ones, then this AI agent can manage your calendar, do your shopping, send the emails. Of course, there are limits and a lot of security risks, but it's really feeding this idea of AI as a personal assistant. And so in the last week or two, we've seen a lot more companies in China holding events where they can help people install this AI tool and talk about, what can it do for you? And there are also small local government districts that have announced big subsidies and free office space to attract people to go there and launch their own companies. There's using this term OPC, one person company, basically the idea that you, a friend, and AI can build a business. I think just as it is in the US and other parts of the world, there's lots of uncertainty on how AI will actually turn into something really commercial. And in fact, some people pointed out to me that part of the reason the Chinese tech companies are giving free open claw installation workshop sessions is because this is now their opportunity to get more users. And to use the open claw system, you actually need to pay something to the cloud companies, to the AI models.
And one of the sort of buzzwords that we've heard a lot about in the last couple of years is involution, this idea of companies fighting to the death in terms of competition, cutting prices, and the government was very concerned about that. And you mentioned this issue of exports being such a significant part of China's growth in the last few years after domestic consumption slowed down in terms of growth. Do you think that the government is serious about preventing this so-called overcapacity and overproduction that has concerned foreign governments so much? We heard the German Chancellor talking about this when he visited China just recently. There was talk at the NPC, I believe, about preventing this kind of excessive competition. How seriously is the government concerned about this, and how much do you think they're able to tackle it?
I think there is growing concern. The question as you said, is how can they really tackle it? They can convene the automotive industry, they can convene the food delivery companies, but at the end of the day, they still want to compete and be businesses and survive. So I think there's still a lot of questions about what that means in practice, and there's many, many ways to compete, and it might not necessarily involve something as straightforward as cutting prices. One development that is interesting is that when Chancellor Merz was in Beijing, part of the Chinese readout was almost an acknowledgement of how the trade surplus is affecting other countries. That's something that I've been hearing also from Chinese scholars at think tanks. And they're saying that as China has this large trade surplus, it's not something that China wants to pursue because now that surplus has an impact on the relationship with those countries. So it seems like that very high level thinking about the impact of trade surplus on diplomatic relations could turn into some sort of policy on the Chinese side to really address the overcapacity, involution, and the tensions that we've seen stem from all these exports.
When you say that they don't want to pursue the surplus, you mean that they would like it to reduce, in fact?
That is one interpretation. I think the idea is more that they want to emphasize that that is not their goal.
But in terms of what actually came out of the NPC, did you see any measures that look likely to have an impact and make a difference in reducing the surplus?
Nothing directly. During the press conference with a lot of the economic leaders, the head of the NDRC, the Economic Planning Agency, he mentioned again they have these plans for guidelines on mergers and acquisitions. And he said the idea here was to help companies exit and reduce some of that inflationary pressure. He seemed to be alluding to, we have all these companies trying to chase something like electric cars, and if they are inefficient, then some sort of M&A might help them exit the market. So that seems like a direction and one solution they are trying.
We also saw the Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi giving his annual press conference in which he talked about global issues and obviously with the focus very much on Iran and the situation in the Middle East. It's been suggested that he has not been as critical of President Trump himself as China might have been expected to. They obviously said they were very unhappy about the war. They said it lacked justification and legitimacy, but they also said they were unhappy with Iran's attacks on its neighbors. What's your feeling about how the Chinese leadership is thinking about the current situation?
What I've started to understand from multiple conversations is that the Chinese side, their foreign policy is much more about how to create an environment where China can thrive. So that doesn't necessarily tie it to a specific country or faction. The thought that comes to mind is that China did not appreciate as much the way the Biden administration engaged with China. So they see Trump as someone more that they can engage with and have discussions and potentially make deals. There does seem to be a sort of a rapport or appreciation for the way that Trump is transactionally. Wang Yi specifically mentioned that the engagement between the country's two leaders has really helped set a direction for both countries. But what this means for US-China relations a bit longer term, I think China hopes for a bit of a framework that isn't so dependent on day-to-day announcements or even changes in the US, who the US president is. Obviously, China has a lot of dependence on oil and some of these other inputs that might be passing through the Strait of Hormuz or otherwise affected by the Iran war. And so that's definitely something that they are focused on. And I think the bigger concern that I've heard is whether or not the tensions will spread to the rest of the Middle East, because we've seen especially Chinese companies expanding more and more into Dubai, into Saudi Arabia. And if what's going on in Iran impacts those regional interests, then I think that's something that China is quite concerned about.
And I know you've been looking at the impact of the oil situation on China, but you seem to be suggesting that China is less affected by this now than in the past, and that that's partly connected with the development of so much new energy in China?
Obviously, at this moment in time, China still relies on significant amount of oil, and one of the reasons why they haven't been directly as impacted by the Iran war is because they have very high amounts of stockpiles, and they've actually been able to get at least 11 or 12 million barrels of oil through the strait from Iran, despite all the tensions. What is significant and why I pointed out the increase in renewables is that it does mean that China is much less reliant on crude oil than it was 20 years ago. And with the 15th five-year plan, China has more plans to reduce its reliance on crude and fossil fuels. And maybe if because of this crisis, China realizes that it has to accelerate some of that renewables push, and it already has a head start, then it might speed things up.
Well, Evelyn Cheng, thank you very much for talking to us on China in Context.
Thank you for having me.
We're joined now by Professor Christopher Mittelstaedt, a specialist on modern Chinese politics and ideology at the University of Zurich, and formerly a lecturer at Oxford University and here at SOAS. Well, Chris, thank you so much for joining us. Now, the five-year plan is a concept which has a long tradition in socialist countries, but is less common in market economies. So how important is it really in today's China?
Well, thank you, first of all, for having me on the podcast. A great pleasure to be here, and I've been a fan of the podcast for a very long time. The five-year plan itself, of course, it's a remnant from the Soviet era, from the Mao era, but it has undergone significant changes. Now it has become in a market-based system, and it is still very heavily state-controlled. It has become more like a framework. So we should not perhaps overestimate the value of the five-year plan, but at the same time, it has become a kind of broad coordinating mechanism to bring various stakeholders from the private sector, from the state-owned enterprises, from the ministries, the party, etc., under one umbrella. And this is also one of the reasons why there is something in there really for everyone. And of course, the five-year plan is not just made up by the central authorities within the last couple of weeks. It's a long process that preceded the drafting of the five-year plan, and the fourth plenum that convened in autumn last year. Xi Jinping gave a speech, and he talked about the drafting process, where there were 6 research teams that were sent to 12 provinces. There was the various research reports on various topics that were commissioned, millions of online comments that were collected, etc. So this would be kind of managed consultation from the center. Of course, the extent to which these millions of online comments then actually make their way into the five-year plan is something that is quite difficult to analyze. But it's very important for them to have this kind of veneer of a democratic, of a consultative process where it's not just top down, it also is supposed to be kind of bottom up.
So there's been so much talk in the build-up to this five-year plan that it will focus on innovation, but particularly on the idea of self-reliance, so that this is innovation that China is doing both to make sure that it is at the forefront of new industry, but also to make sure that it is in a sense secure and not reliant on other countries, clearly one of the significant ones being the US. To what extent is that sort of security and self-reliance issue the most important factor of this five-year plan? In a sense, I'm asking, is ideology still more important than economics, or is this a sort of combination of both?
I mean, to some extent, it is supposed to be the combination of both, even from an ideological perspective. So here, security is necessary for development, and further development then solidifies and consolidates as security. So in a sense that if you become self-reliant, if you become independent from outside external forces, only then you can really develop. To that extent, it is certainly very ideological, but of course, the five-year plan also talks about the real economy. It talks about R&D. It sets some very clear targets on R&D growth, for example, roughly 7% annual growth, which is higher than GDP growth. Also important, obviously, is the whole domestic demand kind of portion. They've been talking about increasing domestic demand for now over 20 years almost. It's been going nowhere, but the 5-year plan does not stipulate any new mechanisms to boost domestic demand. It mainly, from my reading, establishes supply-side mechanisms. For example, this whole investment into new technologies, this whole investment into high-quality development, that remains part of the main governing logic of this 5-year plan, where you have this idea that technology, or this gamble really, that technology is driving productivity growth, which will then result in higher wages, which will then result in more revenue for local governments, which then can provide services, for example, to tend to the elderly and to deal with demographic change, rather than other methods such as, checks or transfers to individual families, to households. So when we talk about self-reliance, we talk about high quality development, we talk about all this investment into manufacturing, we talk about upgrading of both traditional manufacturing and the manufacturing that already exists on a high level. What obviously, and who falls afoul of this, or who is kind of missed in all of this, are, well, the people who don't have that much education, who cannot benefit from these new job opportunities, who need a lot of retraining. Also, people who received their education in the last 15 years, they might have chosen the wrong majors, for example. These are all the losers of this emphasis on high quality development, because they cannot participate in these new roles that are opening up. And they will not necessarily benefit from this gamble that, if it pays off, will have huge ramifications for China's growth model. But if it doesn't, well, then that's perhaps a time bomb in a sense.
So do you see it as a leadership, as it has been pointed out in the past, which has always contained a lot of engineers, that they are really, perhaps at the moment, quite obsessed with the idea of new technology? Do you think that they are paying less attention to issues like, for example, unemployment or the focus on welfare, which, Xi Jinping has referred to, certainly in speeches that he's made, as being very important? But are they not focusing on that as much as some people have hoped?
Perhaps, yeah. I mean, there's a certain bias against welfarism. There's a certain bias against direct transfers. Xi Jinping is on record about that. I mean, when he talks about common prosperity, these kind of key slogans, he does not want people to be dependent on the state. He does not want people to be dependent on welfare. He wants people to hustle, to struggle. So here you have all the struggle rhetoric. However, at the same time, in the 5-year plan, you also have a huge part on investing in people, because obviously if you want to build this high quality development, these new sectors from chips to 6G, etc., you need people to actually work on this, right? So there's a whole lot of support for universities, research centers, basic research, these kind of things under this whole umbrella of investing in people. There are also new metrics for livelihood, for example, for under 3 childcare. There are new aims for nursing care beds. There is also this aim to increase life expectancy to 80.
And is it clear how that will all be funded? I mean, do you see that the government is ready to spend the money needed for this kind of more focused, for example, type of education? Clearly, they're going to put a lot of money into technology as well.
I mean, a lot of this would be funneled through local governments. Central government is probably going to take a bigger or a more active approach, especially when we talk about R&D. But the 5-year plan is quite vague on how this is going to be funded. So here, what we would have to do, and this is something we will be looking out for in the next couple of months, certainly, are new 5-year plans for different sectors. So you will have a 5-year plan for, I don't know, cultural development. You will have a sectoral 5-year plan for industrial development. This can be then becomes more detailed. And we will see new aims there. They will come out of all the ministries or a selection of ministries joined together. We will also probably see new aims at the provincial levels. They've already published a lot of recommendations starting in late October last year. So here we also see divergences in the different provinces from the 5-year plan that was now published. They have different priorities, which is not very surprising if you look at the makeup of the various provinces. So here what happens, or what has already happened really, is these divergences in local development plans that are now all being brought under this umbrella of the 5-year plan. And now we're looking for these sectoral divergences and clearer aims coming from the individual ministries that then have to be funded.
The fact that they have now reduced the growth target from the 5% GDP growth that we've had over the last number of years, and also that they are now focusing or talking much more about this idea of higher quality growth, which many analysts have said goes hand in hand with the idea that you're not just pursuing the highest GDP growth possible. How significant do you think this is? And in real terms, what does higher quality manufacturing mean, and what does higher quality growth really look like?
There are a couple of aspects here. One aspect is certainly focusing on the digital economy, and this is one aspect where they were quite clear. For example, they are targeting 12.5% of GDP for the digital economy, which is now 10.5%. But also in practical terms, what they're interested in is this broad array of technologies that are from quantum, from chips going towards 6G, etc., or different ways of producing chips, semiconductors, to get around these choke points that they're experiencing now, and many technologies.
So the controls on what's allowed to be imported from the US, for example.
Exactly. And many of these technologies have not been proven yet. So there's a lot of gambling on processes that have not matured yet, that we don't know can or cannot be scaled in the future. So there's a lot of that in the 5-year plan, basically, to say, okay, we try all of these things and we'll see what works out. And if something doesn't work out, well, if one thing or two things work out, that will be enough to justify the real waste of resources, of financial human resources that are wasted really in these technologies that do not work out. In terms of the GDP growth target, 4.5%, I mean, to some extent, it's just a number. If they say they want to reach 5%, they can reach 5% without any problems, because of the number of levers that the Chinese party state has at its disposal.
But the implication now is perhaps that they won't be forcing people to do things that don't make rational market sense in order just to hit abstract targets.
I mean, some analysts, and I would agree with them, is saying that 4.5 to 5% is way too high for an economy as big as China's. More realistic also in terms of, if you want to really rebalance towards consumption, would be perhaps 2%, perhaps less.
One thing that we saw where ideology was clearly in play at this NPC and that we've seen over recent months is the continuation of Xi Jinping's major anti-corruption campaign, and we've obviously seen the removal of a number of top military leaders over recent months. We've had other party officials punished, and the former party boss of Hubei has just been charged for a corruption case involving bribery. Some people have looked at the comments Xi Jinping made in his speeches at the NPC, and he talked about the military and said there must be absolutely no place in the military for those who harbour disloyalty to the party or for corrupt elements. Do you see that this is only going to continue to deepen? Or do you think that having really, more or less, some people would say, decapitated the military in recent months, that it can't go much further?
I think there are two things going on. One is the anti-corruption drive within the military. So that's, I would say, nearing its conclusion with decapitation of effectively the Central Military Commission, which is now down to 2 members. But not just about the Central Military Commission. If you go several ranks down, it's actually penetrating the military's leadership increasingly. And there is no natural ending point here, but at some point one could argue that it has to be over. And another anti-corruption campaign which has been ongoing is the normal, quote unquote, anti-corruption campaign that has hit a new record in recent months, and that shows no signs of slowing down.
So this is among government officials within the Communist Party?
This is among government officials within the Communist Party, but here we're talking about tens of thousands every month that are being disciplined. And here we're not talking about the leadership, we're talking about local cadres at the township level. We're talking about the implementers of policy. And here comes the 5-year plan back in a sense, because there's a new campaign starting now after the 2 sessions on the correct view of achievements within the party state. So here one would expect anti-corruption to deepen, to focus not on corruption per se, for example, banquets and bribery and these kind of things. Becomes more political or increasingly political. It becomes about non-implementation of directives, non-implementation of orders that are written down in these plans. So if you don't implement something, then you can get hit. And we've seen that already over the last couple of years, where 40 to 50% of all cases were because of the non-implementation of directives.
So sometimes it's just officials who are not trying very hard to implement the policies, then, would you say? It's not necessarily that they have a great ideological dissension from the party line.
That's right. It's not because you are not ideologically aligned with the party center, but of course, this could be framed that way. But effectively, it's about failing to carry out these policies. And anti-corruption and the whole apparatus is just the enforcement instrument for that.
The other aspect of sort of ideological control that was prominent at the National People's Congress over the past few weeks was this law on promoting ethnic unity. Ethnic Unity and Progress is its formal name. And it emphasizes a national security perspective to protecting the dignity of national symbols and the flag, but it's also about bringing different ethnic groups together under the party's guidance, as it were. And obviously some people have said that it's very much designed to control different ethnic minority groups in China. How do you see this, and how significant do you think this is?
It's a very terrifying law, but for other reasons that go beyond what has been described as a kind of legal capstone or a consolidation of Xi Jinping era ethnic policy. What analysts say, that's all in there. Obviously, Mandarin as a default, you have unified textbooks.
So that the different groups in Xinjiang, in Tibet, the kids are meant to be using Mandarin in schools all the way through. In the past, there used to be some opt-outs for ethnic groups.
Yes, deletion of like minority language, these kind of exemptions. This can also be framed in terms of countering Western ideological influence, especially with regard to Tibet and in Xinjiang, of course. But going beyond that, I would argue that this law is part of a broader infrastructure or part of a broader architecture for ideological conformity. It's about establishing a common historical narrative. So it's about controlling history, and it's also about institutional penetration. So for example, Article 41 talks about how the party committee leads, government administers. You have the United Front, which is responsible for ethnic minority work. They are coordinating. You have actually the law going into the family itself, encouraging the family or telling the family how to educate their children. If the parents say something wrong, then there's a way for children to denounce the parents. So here, this really goes into the basic cell of society, into the family itself, and creates really this enforcement mechanism across every domain of social life. I mean, we have to look at how it's implemented and how it actually works out. One would also expect pushback from families, of course. But it's really thought of, in my reading, as establishing this kind of governance architecture. And ethnic policy or the ethnic domain is just a proving ground, and this is a template for potentially more to come.
There's one clause which talks about the fact that different ethnic groups should live in mixed communities. Again, this sounds like it potentially has all kinds of ramifications.
Yes, this dilution, this idea that, well, now we're living under a common framework. There's a huge emphasis on correct perspectives on the nation, history, ethnicity, culture, and religion.
I've seen it,
Yeah.
just what they're doing described as assimilation over pluralism, basically.
I think that's exactly right. But I think what I would highlight more is the institutional, the integrative aspect of this. A lot of these things, they've been happening for a long time already. For example, Mandarin education in Tibet, Xinjiang minority areas, etc. So if you read the law, there's a lot in there that's already been happening. But what this does now is to integrate everything into one law, into one framework, and puts institutional heft behind it. And I think that's significant.
Well, Christopher Mittelstaedt, thank you so much for joining us on China in Context.
Thank you so much for having me.
That's all we have time for on this episode. You can find out more about SOAS China Institute events and read our blog articles on our website soas.ac.uk. For now, thanks for listening and goodbye.